looked at in this subunit how cultural division and economic change were a key part of the Roaring Twenties. Now, during the Roaring Twenties, we often associate it with the Ford Model T, jazz, speakeasies, flappers, prosperity, and a nonstop party. But in reality, it's a little more complicated than that. Now, certainly there was economic prosperity in the 1920s, and a big reason for that is America leveled up its production abilities. We were able to make household goods in a way that we could never before. And two of the big reasons for that were Taylorism, where Frederick Winslow Taylor would go from factory to factory, timing workers and seeing who had the most productive way of going about producing goods. We also had Henry Ford's assembly line, which made the automobile so much cheaper and revolutionized the human interactions with machinery in creating an efficient product. This made it so that not only did people have the ability to make things at a much quicker rate, but it also meant that we had less angry workers because we had better working conditions. Henry Ford's factory practiced something called welfare capitalism, which meant that workers were getting benefits in the workplace, like a cafeteria, an 8-hour workday, and a $5 workday, making it so that it was much more feasible to work and still have a good life outside of the job. In addition to this, we also have a lot of people buying and buying and buying and buying and buying in the Roaring Twenties. One of the big things that people looked at were a lot of the things that they would have in the household: vacuum cleaners, cars and toasters and blenders and many other appliances which had not been available for so cheap to the middle class in the past. Now, in addition to all that purchasing, we also have stuff in the background which is driving it, including buying on credit. In the 1920s, there was a lot of borrowing and also a lot of people buying and paying later. So they would pay for something over time instead of paying for it up front, which meant that people were able to afford things that they had not been able to in the past. We also have the rise of the advertising industry, where we see people like Sigmund Freud, a psychologist, tapping into the human understanding and using that and leveraging that to get people to purchase things. And in class, we looked at how in the 1920s, flappers were advertised to. Now, flappers were sort of a fashion movement, not so much fashion, but more of a social fashion movement where women pushed to live more modernly. They were drinking, they wore makeup. Some even had sex before marriage. They had jobs and participated in politics. And again, this just pushed up against what were considered traditional American values. There are many Americans that still believe that people shouldn't drink, etc. But the point is that during the 1920s, especially in urban areas, women began to push against the old norms of the cult of domesticity and challenge them with fashion and their lifestyle. All right. From there, we looked at how, despite the fact that people were buying, there was also a series of authors, people from the lost generation, who criticized the way in which people lived in the 1920s. People felt that people were living in a way that was simply surface level, not really digging deeper. They only thought about things they could buy rather than living, on a human level. They felt it was too lavish and they were critical of the materialism. And this group is called the Lost Generation. I like to think of them as like the 20th century equivalent of the transcendentalists, like Henry David Thoreau, who criticized life during the market revolution and who felt that life was bigger than work in a factory. And I have a quote from Great Gatsby that I feel like summarizes the mindset of the Lost Generation, where Gatsby is this phony, despite the fact that he's rich, he's not actually able to live a life that he feels is really fulfilling. And it's largely because he doesn't really have any human to him. He's living a fake life because of all of his belongings and things. So to summarize, new tech enabled the production of consumer goods. The advertising industry promoted all this buying, and the Lost Generation was critical of it. We talked about the Great Migration during World War I, and this led to the Harlem Renaissance. During the 1920s, we saw a flourishing of African American art, music, literature, and intellectual thought. People like Langston Hughes, who's a great poet, wrote about the struggles of coming to the North from the South. And while it was fulfilling and exciting, and potentially have made for a better life, people had to abandon their homes, and this is a challenge for many people. Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong revolutionized the genre of jazz. Artists like Jacob Lawrence painted the lived experience of Black folks, challenging racial stereotypes and celebrating Black culture. And we looked at some of the art of the Harlem Renaissance, like the song Strange Fruit. But that being said, while Black people lived a much more fulfilling life in the North, being able to have greater freedom, there was also a significant reaction to that. And in the 1920s, while migrants created rich regional forms of arts and expression, there was also significant resistance to this change, and racial hatred reemerges in the 1920s after the World War I. Nativists called for an end to immigration and sought to intimidate Black folks who moved to the North. And we saw that exemplified through the Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation ended up creating major racist stereotypes for Black folks and glorified the Ku Klux Klan, leading to a resurgence of the Klan in the 1920s. We also saw that there were major immigration quotas, which limited how many people could move from Europe and countries around the world during the 1920s because nativism was at a fever pitch during this time period. These quota acts, which were inspired by these nativist campaigns, especially targeted folks from Southern and Eastern Europe, and even created literacy tests to try and limit the entry of people from countries like Poland, Russia, Italy, and even people from Asia were outright continually banned from migrating to the United States. So if we take a look here, this huge period of migration that we looked at up to the 1820s largely came to a halt. Now, the last thing that we looked at were the differences between fundamentalists and modernists. Fundamentalists were people who wanted to maintain traditional values. They looked to the past as the way that we should aspire to, whereas modernists wanted to look towards the future and try to change the way that we lived our lives, pursuing maybe a more open-minded and a more progress-seeking mentality. So in Tennessee, a great example of this was the creation of the Butler Law, where in this rural community, they enforced the fact that the Bible was to be taught in schools rather than evolution. And so a teacher, John Scopes, spoke out against this and actually taught evolution, leading to his arrest. In this case, the Scopes trial was a huge moment during the 1920s, where we see people of various backgrounds coming together in this town and converging and really criticizing the lifestyles of one another, where we see fundamentalists and modernists being very critical of one another's lifestyles. All right. Now, the last thing I'm going to do in part 2 of this video is talk through the Depression and the New Deal. During the Roaring '20s, remember, we have all this economic prosperity and growth, and a part of that is because we have a return to a laissez-faire mindset from the conservative presidents of the 1920s. They believed in what was called trickle-down economics, where during the 1920s, the belief was if we help the rich by giving them tax cuts and deregulation of business, the money would trickle down to the rest of society. And so in the 1920s, we have very business-friendly policies. Now, as a result, people see the stock market go up and they take out very risky investments. Banks loaned a ton of money to people who would then purchase stocks, which were very risky. They bought on the margin, it was called. We also see people bought a lot on credit, and there was a big overproduction of goods, which people only needed so many of, right? You can only have so many cars in your garage. That being said, in 1929, the stock market crashed because of all of these factors. And on Black Tuesday, 13 million shares were sold, creating a world record that still stands true today. A year later, 26,000 businesses were wiped out, and by 1933, 50% of banks were closed. Now, Herbert Hoover, who was the president during this time, ends up telling the people that they should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They need to deal with things on their own. His mindset was that the people need to rely on themselves, not the government, for their own well-being. So as a result, at the beginning, people responded with volunteerism. This is why Hoovervilles emerge, where people blame Herbert Hoover for their homelessness, and they move into what are called, again, Hoovervilles, which were named that after Hoover. We also have the Dust Bowl, which was horrible conditions. Now, the Hawley Smoot tariff is like the one thing that Herbert Hoover actually tries to pass during this time period. It's the second largest tariff in U.S. history, and it really led to retaliation by other countries and brought the economy to an even worse position. And so Herbert Hoover was totally demonized. We even have veterans of the First World War marching on the White House and Congress looking for bonuses because they were so broke, right? And like I mentioned, because of overproduction of the soil out west, we also see the Dust Bowl. So we have compounding problems, right? On the East Coast and the West Coast, we have horrible living conditions. We have people out of jobs, unemployment's at a huge rate. And then we have in the middle of the country, in the plains, this Dust Bowl, which made it so that people had to flee their land to go seek out a better life. And those refugees were called Okies or Arkies if they were from Oklahoma or Arkansas. Now, all of these problems lead to the FDR election of 1932, where as he promises the New Deal, Hoover gets wiped out. And so FDR is going to promise a new mindset here of a shift towards a more powerful government that would be able to deal with these problems. In his first 100 days in office, FDR revolutionized the banking system by introducing the New Deal. Him and his brain trust of people designed plans which he communicated to the people through fireside chats. And during this time period, we have the creation of the New Deal, which targeted three big issues: relief, recovery, and reform. And we return to like this mindset of the progressive era, trying to achieve a degree of progress in reforming the problems of the Great Depression. And so the New Deal greatly expands the size and the role of the federal government, which led to lots of spending to get the economy back on track, which created programs that hired people to improve infrastructure, regulate banks, and reform the labor system. So the New Deal is hugely important in changing the role of government. And again, we see this through various programs like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, and the Social Security Act. And folks, as I said, I'd encourage you to know at least one of these programs for each of the three R's for relief, recovery, and reform. Now, not everybody was in favor of the New Deal. Some people criticized the New Deal as being too socialist. And this even led to the creation of a conservative manifesto in which conservatives in Congress said that FDR was becoming too socialist, was threatening capitalism, increased the debt by over 50%. And so FDR was seen as sort of power hungry. And they have a point. You know, FDR does seize a lot of power for the government. One of the other big issues that FDR faced were the conservatives on the Supreme Court who struck down key policies like the Agricultural Adjustment Act in NIRA, which sought to, again, get the economy back on track. So FDR conducts a scheme to actually pack the courts with new justices, which would allow for him to basically have puppets on the court, as this cartoon depicts, where they would basically do what he wanted them to do and continually pass New Deal policies. Now, here's the thing. The Supreme Court doesn't end up doing this. He's not able to pack the courts, but we end up having a change on the Supreme Court because of a couple retirements and deaths of justices, and FDR ends up getting a much more friendly court to the New Deal by the time he's out of office. Now, FDR was also criticized from the left because Roosevelt was seen as not doing enough by some leftists. People like Huey Long, who believed that we needed to enter into the Share Our Wealth program. And if you take a look at the proposals they have here, they are much more radical, including a 30-hour work week, a 4-work-week vacation, limited inheritances, a limited income, also a minimum income. So Huey Long was a much more critical leftist, and he felt as though that we needed to do more than what was being done by the New Deal. And so others felt that Roosevelt didn't prioritize the average person, but instead was helping out big bankers and big business. So, to conclude, the New Deal was deemed successful by some, but a failure by others. It created many jobs. It created a reformed social welfare program, which allowed for, again, people to obtain things like Social Security, where they pay in over time, but then when they retirement could get a check, or if they were to become disabled, they could get a check from the government. We were able to strengthen labor unions, but also reform the banks. But that doesn't mean that the New Deal was perfect. The New Deal did not fully fix the Great Depression. It also left the government in greater debt than it had ever before because of the expense of these New Deal programs. And finally, the New Deal also included some segregation, and not all people enjoyed the rights of the New Deal equally. Black men, Black women, and white women in general were precluded for a lot of programs because of the types of jobs that they had, but also some of the women and some of the, or excuse me, some of the Black folks that were able to actually get positions under the New Deal would often be placed in segregated camps, which of course meant that they weren't living an equal experience. Okay, folks, I'll have one more part for this coming at you later on, going over World War II.